Good morning, everyone. This is the second part of the vascular physiology series of lectures, and we will pick up at the place where we left off last time. We're going to be going over some of the control mechanisms that regulate arterial lumen. So the local as well as the extrinsic factors. We will also discuss the factors that affect blood viscosity, and we'll also go over the vascular compliance and distensibility both in physiology and pathophysiology. And then we will relate most of these concepts to the regulation of vasotone and systemic vascular resistance. And towards the end, we will discuss veins and venous resistance as well as peripheral venous pressure. So to regulate the lumen of these arterioles, there are several mechanisms that are in place. There are some local controls, and these mostly we focus on flow autoregulation, active hyperemia, and then we also have the extrinsic controls, which include sympathetic nerves, very little, if anything, from the parasympathetic, as we will see, non-cholinergic, non-adrenergic neurons, as well as hormones. The local controls that we started with, two basic ones, the active hyperemia and the flow autoregulation. They are very simple concepts, but they are very important, and they actually make sense. Take the active hyperemia, for example. If the metabolic activity of a given tissue increases or a given organ increases, it means we're using a lot of oxygen, and then we're producing carbon dioxides and other metabolites. The increase in metabolites and the decrease in oxygen is going to cause the arteriole to dilate, and that would mean that you're going to get more blood flow to that organ. So that basically restores the level of oxygen that you've lost, and then it removes the carbon dioxide that you've just generated. For the flow autoregulation, it's very similar, except that here, instead of looking at the metabolic activity as the impetus or as the stimulus for the mechanism, it's actually a drop in blood pressure. So if arterial pressure in a given organ decreases, that means you're going to have less flow coming to that organ. And now they become similar to the active hyperemia. When you have a decreased blood flow, it means the amount of oxygen that's being delivered to that very tissue is reduced. The concentration of metabolites within the vicinity of that tissue is going to increase. And also because there is less flow coming, it means there is less stretch, there is less force going onto the wall, onto the vessel wall. The response to these stimuli would be to dilate the organ so that you have more blood flow coming, and thus that blood pressure will go up within that vessel, within that given vessel. Here what we're showing is reactive hyperemia, which is similar to flow autoregulation, except that it is an extreme form. What happens in this figure, what we're showing is the effects of a 2-minute occlusion on blood flow. What happens if you completely occlude this blood vessel, this artery? So what happens, blood flow goes to zero during the occlusion. When the occlusion, however, is released, as you would expect, blood flow is going to increase. The important thing here is that it dramatically and quickly increases. That means hyperemia is taking place, and that increase lasts for several minutes. The hyperemia that happened took place because during, and this is very important, because we would have expected that the response would be to go back to normal, to where it was. So it was here, then during the occlusion it went to this level, and then one would have expected that as soon as we release the occlusion, the blood flow will go back to normal. The thing is, this is not what happens. The thing is, we have this rapid and dramatic increase in the blood flow, and then eventually it goes back and gets restored to the normal level of blood flow. So what happened during this phase, during this occlusion, tissue hypoxia has taken place. A buildup of the vasodilator metabolites, including adenosine, is there, and these are going to dilate arterioles. And the reason for that is, think about it as a defensive mechanism. You've realized that there is no blood coming. The tissue is going to want to oppose what just happened. So hypoxia itself, adenosine as a metabolite, they're going to dilate arterioles, and that's going to decrease decrease vascular resistance, and thus when the perfusion pressure is restored, i.e. when the occlusion is released, the flow becomes dramatically elevated because of the reduced vascular resistance that has just been imparted by adenosine and other metabolites, in addition to the hypoxia that happened. Moreover, the buildup of carbon dioxide is important because as soon as there is a chance, carbon dioxide itself can act as a vasodilator. So during the hyperemia, the tissue becomes reoxygenated and the vasodilator metabolites are washed out of the tissue. This means that the resistance vessels are going to regain their normal vasotone or vascular tone, and then the blood flow will go back to the normal or control level. So for the extrinsic controls, there are sympathetic, as I mentioned, that's one of them. Take the skin arterioles as an example. During cold temperatures, what happens if you feel cold, if you're subjected to cold temperature, the superficial circulation, the skin arterioles are going to constrict, and that's a defensive mechanism because your body doesn't want you to lose heat to the outside, so it basically causes the constriction of superficial arterioles or skin arterioles and reroutes the blood to the inner circulation as a defensive mechanism. And actually that's exactly the opposite. What happens when temperature goes up or when you're working out, you realize that your veins are bulging up. So basically the arterioles and the superficial circulation is going to be more dilated, so that more blood is going to the skin so that you can get to lose heat when you're working out, for example. There are other instances where these mechanisms can take place, examples in fear or when there is hemorrhage. You'll cover that in a different lecture. The parasympathetic, before I get to the parasympathetic, what I mentioned about cold-induced vasoconstriction, that's a normal physiologic defensive mechanism that the body uses to minimize heat loss. However, sometimes this is exacerbated or augmented, and that can lead to a pathology known as Raynaud's phenomenon. And Raynaud's phenomenon occurs by virtue of a receptor that is a unique receptor. It's called alpha-2C adrenergic receptor. For the parasympathetic nerves, with few exceptions, little or no important parasympathetic innervation of arterioles takes place. The non-cholinergic, non-adrenergic autonomic neurons, these are very important in their, by virtue of their ability to release nitric oxide. This is a very potent vasodilator. Of course, they do release some other molecules. So nitric oxide is an important gasotransmitter. The fourth category that is important as an extrinsic control mechanism takes place via different hormones. You've just finished the endocrine system, so some of the examples include epinephrine, angiotensin, vasopressin, and atrial natriuretic peptide. And as the name, for example, vasopressin, as we've covered in Med 1, so that would tell you that this is a protein that's pressing on the blood vessels, or a protein that's inducing tension in a blood vessel, and so on. There are different ways for reading names. This would be important. You'll cover that later on when they mention increase in blood volume is going to cause the atrium to release this molecule, and that's gonna help in natriuresis. So as a quick summary of what I just mentioned, there is a diversity of signals, and this implies a diversity of receptors and consequently potential diversity of signaling transduction mechanisms. So the neural controls, we mentioned sympathetic and parasympathetic. Well, we mentioned that the parasympathetic are very minimal, so the vasoconstrictors would be the sympathetic. For the vasodilators, we mentioned gasotransmitter nitric oxide. In terms of hormones, we gave these examples, and of course, epinephrine can act as a vasoconstrictor or as a vasodilator, depending on the receptors and the tissues. In terms of local controls, we mentioned at the beginning hyperemia and so on. So endothelin is the most potent natural vasoconstrictor, and we mentioned a decrease in oxygen as a potential vasodilator. You see CO2 and H+ are related to each other because if CO2 is increasing in the vicinity of a tissue, you'd expect CO2 plus H2O to give you H2CO3. H2CO3 is going to give you H+ plus HCO3-. So they are similar. K+ is very interesting as well because K+ would induce vasodilation. You would not expect to see K+ on the extracellular side. If you do, it may indicate that there's a cell damage, and then if there is cell damage, you need more blood coming to fix the area and wash away the different molecules. Bradykinin, for example, is from kininogen that is broken down by the enzyme kallikrein and so on. So there are many molecules that could play an important role in vasodilation. Eicosanoids, you're going to cover that in different lectures as well. So what are the factors that affect viscosity as an important factor that we talked about in the overall resistance and thus blood pressure and flow? So one of the factors is hematocrit. Remember, hematocrit is the volume of blood that is occupied by red blood cells. It is usually higher in men owing to the testosterone primarily, so 40 to 52% in men and roughly 36 to 45 in females. The factors that would affect this viscosity would be high altitude, and that makes sense because when at higher altitude the levels of oxygen is decreased, the body is fooled. The body will start to think that if there's no oxygen, so maybe there is not enough RBCs, so the body responds by increasing the quantity of RBCs that's made, and that's going to lead to an increase in the hematocrit. Similarly, severe dehydration, you're removing the water, so basically that's going to lead to higher viscosity. Of course, hemorrhaging or significant recent blood loss, that's going to be a factor, or any change in the RBC content. So these are the factors that are important. Of course, there are other factors that affect blood viscosity, including plasma protein concentration, the different types of proteins in the plasma, and so on. The viscosity of normal blood is roughly 3 times that of water, and as the viscosity increases, you'd expect the flow to decrease. We mentioned that yesterday, and we gave the example also. If you want to withdraw honey using a straw or water using the same straw, it's going to be more resistance. So, and we mentioned the relation between viscosity and also turbulence. So the viscosity is largely due to RBCs. They increase the frictional drag against each other as well as against the cell, the vessel wall, the endothelia. And in the figure below, you see that as the hematocrit is increasing, the viscosity is going to increase. Now remember this equation. We mentioned that last time, that in average healthy adult, there is little appreciable change in viscosity or length, and that's why we focused on the radius. However, if viscosity changes due to any of the previous factors that we talked about today, or in the previous lecture when we talked about pregnant women, then you'd expect that to have an effect on the resistance. And you know this equation, resistance is going to have an effect or an impact on the flow and so on. There are other factors that do affect viscosity. Temperature is a very good example. And one of the examples, they would say if somebody is not being very cooperative, they say he's like molasses in cold winter. So imagine that you have to basically pour molasses from a jar in a very cold weather. So the colder the blood, the thicker it is, and thus the more difficult it is to move, and thus the flow becomes slower. So it is an inverse relation between the viscosity and temperature. Viscosity increases roughly about 2% for each degree centigrade decrease in temperature. And there is a clinical value for that when you cover this in Med 3 later on, that during whole body hypothermia, this is sometimes important in critical care or surgical situations. These are going to lead, this whole body hypothermia can lead to an increase in blood viscosity, and it may affect, while it may have some advantages, it may also impair the organ blood flow. That may lead, if it becomes not well controlled, it may lead to organ damage. In some instances, some patients may suffer due to whole body hypothermia, may suffer from exacerbated episodes of Raynaud's phenomenon if they already have that condition. Now we come to a very important concept in vascular physiology, which is vascular distensibility. This is a very valuable feature. This is an important characteristic. It's really a feature of the vascular system, is that all its vessels are distensible. And distensibility allows these vessels to accommodate more blood coming into them. It allows them to accommodate the pulsatile nature or the pulsatile output of the heart. And after that, it also helps smoothen the continuous flow through the very small blood vessels. And this is related to the fact that it has to do with how much increase in volume we can put relative to an increase in blood pressure multiplied by the original volume. We'll get to that equation in a second. So basically, the distensibility in this case is going to allow me to get more blood into a given vessel. Had the vessel not been very distensible, in other words, let's assume the opposite, had the vessel not been distensible, we would not be able to put as much blood into the vessel without suffering from damage either to the wall or a dramatic increase in the pressure, the overall systemic pressure. When we talk about distensibility, it is important to mention that veins are more distensible than arteries. You already know from your anatomy that a vein compared to its equivalent artery has a wider lumen. So distensibility is an important factor. And part of the reason is that the walls of the arteries are also thicker and stronger. However, from a practical point of view, it's more important for us to know, pay attention, it is more important for us to know the total quantity of blood that can be stored in a given vessel for each millimeter Hg pressure rise. I.e., if I give you two different vessels and I tell you about the distensibility, it wouldn't be much relevant to you. But if I tell you that vessel number 1, for every 1 millimeter Hg pressure increase of this vessel, you can accommodate, for example, 50 milliliters more. Vessel number 2, for the same 1 millimeter Hg, you can put 20. That tells you that vessel 1 is, in this case, more compliant. You're going to be able to put more blood in vessel 1 at the expense of raising the blood pressure by only one value, 1 millimeter Hg. So a highly distensible vessel that has a small volume may have less capacitance or compliance than, pay attention, than a less distensible vessel that has a large volume, because simply compliance, which is what we care about, is not only distensibility, it's distensibility and the volume that I can put in. So this equation helps us understand compliance. Compliance is basically the increase in the volume, that's delta V, divided by the increase in pressure, that's delta P. So if you want to jot down an example, you can just create any example. So you had a certain vessel, initial volume was, say, 20, you made the new volume 25. So you had a change of 5 in the delta volume. When you increase this volume by 5, what happened to the pressure? How much did we have increased? If we had a lot of increase, it means the compliance is low, right? Because for the increase in the volume, I had a dramatic increase in the pressure. The delta V divided by delta P is going to be lower. So if you think about it, when you take a vein, you can put a larger volume with minimal increase in pressure. It is distensible and has a wider lumen. This means that the compliance of the vein is much higher than that of the artery. As a matter of fact, the vein is about 8 times as distensible, and it has a volume of about 3 times. We mentioned a while ago that if we were to calculate the compliance, we said it is equal to the distensibility times the volume. So in this case, it would be 24 times that of the corresponding artery. In other words, what we're saying here is, how easy is it? So there are different ways of looking at it. How easy is it when you want to increase the volume in a certain vessel? How easy would it be, or how much pressure are you going to suffer? All right. So a given change in pressure was going to cause a change in volume and vice versa. So they are related to each other, but we're primarily looking at the ease by which a given change in pressure causes a change in the volume. So if you compare the compliance, maybe this makes the concept clearer. If you compare the compliance between an artery and the equivalent vein, in both cases, whether we're looking at the artery in this case, or whether we're looking at the vein, in both cases, as the pressure is increasing, the volume that we can put in is increasing, right? Excuse me. So the importance of this is that at low pressures, if you look at this, take any pressure here and project on both. The volume that you can put in an artery is here. The volume that you can put in a vein is there. So at any given pressure, the vein is more compliant than the artery. Actually, the same curve can be used. What happens can be used to determine what happens if you increase the volume. So if you take this volume, that high volume, and look what happens to this pressure here, compare it to this volume, and this is the pressure. So P1, P2. So as also the volume increases, the pressure within a vessel is going to increase. So anyway, the take-home message from this is that the vein is much more compliant than its equivalent artery. And as I mentioned earlier, this is related both to the smooth muscle content as well as the extracellular matrix, the nature of the vessel itself, in addition to the lumen, to the width of the lumen. Now we come to a very important application that is related to the compliance of the vessels that we're talking about, and we're going to focus on the aorta in this case. So in the top part of the figure, so A and B, we're talking about compliant arteries. During systole, the arterial blood flow is going through the capillaries throughout the whole systolic phase. Because the arteries are normally compliant, a large or significant fraction of the stroke volume is basically stored in the arteries. In other words, as the left ventricle is pumping the blood, all that blood is going to go into the aorta. But look at the shape of the aorta. We have, in this case, we had a bulging out of the aorta. Instead of it was like this, so it bulged out. Now what happened during this time, because it is compliant, some of the pressure is stored within the walls. That's why these are called pressure reservoir. And of course, some of the flow of the blood continues to flow normally. During diastole or diastole, what happens, arterial blood continues to flow through the capillaries throughout, and part of it is basically because of the recoil of these vessels. So during systole, what happened, this vessel bulged outwards, that stretched to the outside. During diastole or diastole, what happens, there is a recoil backwards. That recoil is going to give the pressure, the force that is sufficient to continue to keep the blood moving through the capillaries. And as such, because we have compliant arteries, blood is going to continuously move during diastole or diastole. However, when we have rigid arteries, what happens, a stroke volume is being pumped. So as the ventricle is pumping blood, remember, look at the walls here, they are rigid, they're not compliant. So basically the force that is being used here to eject the blood out is going to go into the vessels. However, the wall here is not compliant. I am not going to have bulging outwards, and thus I am not going to have a pressure reservoir. So all the blood that I have are going to go through. But then when this ventricle is relaxing, so during diastole, what happens, the flow to the capillaries is going to stop because there is nothing. There is no new force to continue to push the blood forward. So in the first case, what happened during diastole, as the heart was relaxing, the vessels recoiled, this vessel recoiled, and that gave a new push for the blood to continue. So we always had a force pushing the blood during the initial phase and during the latter phase or diastole. If the arteries were rigid, what we're gonna have blood flow going here, but there is no blood flow during this phase. There is another problem. Imagine that you're pumping a lot of blood into a vessel that is very rigid, that's not compliant to you. It's basically going against what's gonna happen. It's going against the force that is being put onto it from the pumping force of the heart. And this is going to have a dramatic impact on many things, including energy expenditure and blood flow. So the first thing that we mentioned here is the problem is going to be that we're not going to have any blood flow if the vessels are very rigid. And the second thing, we'll elaborate on it later on, is the energy expenditure. Let's look at one other application in the next slide. So let's put them into context, the compliant versus the rigid, and the impact on flow, as we mentioned, and the impact on the pressure increase that we're going to have. So here, basically, for us to limit the cardiac work that is required during ejection, what we need to do, the energy that is necessary for the arterial distension and for the recoil should be minimized, should be low. In other words, for a given stroke volume that the heart is going to employ, the pressure increase, the pressure increase for that stroke volume should be minimized, should be as small as possible. In other words, we don't want the pressure to go extremely high when we have stroke volume and then it becomes very low when we don't have a stroke volume. That's ideal. The efficiency of this function depends primarily on the geometry of the artery, but also, and very relevantly here, on the stiffness, on the rigidity or compliance of the blood vessel. When the rigidity is minimal, the arterial wall opposes the low resistance to distension and the pressure effect is minimized. So this is good. However, when the arterial system is rigid and cannot be stretched, the entire stroke volume must flow through the arterial system and peripheral tissues only during systole, because that's when we have pressure. And this will have two consequences. We will have intermittent flow and short capillary transit time, and we'll have that would lead to reduced metabolic exchange. Let me elaborate on that. So in this example here, we're talking about a rigid tube. So during the downstroke, the pumped flow, imagine that this is the heart pumping, and in this tube, it's like this force. So we are pushing downwards. During the push downward, during the downstroke, we are pumping, we are putting 200 milliliters per second for 0.5 seconds. During the upward movement, there is nothing. There's 0 ml pushed into the system for 0.5 seconds. So there is nothing wrong with that. Here's the thing. Because the vessel is rigid, this is rigid vessel here, we are not going to be able to take any of the pressure that's been put into the system. We cannot take any of that pressure into the wall. So basically everything that is pumped will have to go through. So during the downstroke, all right, what I have, assuming that we have a resistance of 1, all right, so the resistance is 1 multiplied by the flow. That's going to give me the pressure during the downstroke. That's going to be 200, right? So remember here, the downstroke is 200 for 0.5 seconds, and assuming that the resistance is 1, so in this case, I have the pressure of 200 times 1, and I will get 200. During the upstroke, there is nothing being pumped into, there is no pressure, all right? So the resistance is 1, the flow is 0, as we mentioned here. During the upstroke, there is 0 flow. There's nothing that's being put into, and thus the pressure is going to be 0. So what this means is that during the downstroke, I will have a pressure of 200. During the upstroke, I will have a pressure of 0. During the downstroke, 200, 0. So basically your pressure would be 200, 0, 200, 0, and so on. What happens also to the flow in this case? During the downstroke, we said you're going to have 200 milliliters per second for 0.5. That's 200. That's for the flow. And then during the upward, there's nothing happening. So you're also going to have blood, no blood, blood, no blood. So meaning flow, no flow. That's definitely going to be damaging for the tissues. Metabolic exchange is going to be dramatically reduced. There is very short capillary transit time, and the pressure, the very high pressure, is going to cause a lot of problems and energy expenditures. Let's go to the next case when the vessel is compliant. Same numbers as we're ejecting, so stroke volume. The downstroke would be 200 mils per second for 0.5 seconds. During the upwards, we have 0 mils that are being injected into the system for 0.5 seconds. So this is very similar to that. However, pay attention here. During the downstroke, because this is a compliant vessel, not all the pressure that is put in, not all the volume is going to completely go through. We mentioned a while ago that the vessel is going to bulge outwards. This is basically the pressure reservoir. So some of the fluid is going to continue, and some of it is going basically to be used to push the vessel outwards. And thus we are storing pressure, and somewhat we are storing volume in this case. The pressure in this case is going to be continuously at 100 because it starts at 100. Anything extra will go to the walls. As soon as this blood that's moving at 100 starts to decrease, we will get from the ones that we are stored into the system, and then we'll keep this at 100. The beautiful thing about this is that your pressure will continue to be at 100, and the beautiful thing about this, the outflow will continue to be 100. So you will always have a constant good pressure and a continuous blood flow that allows for efficient metabolic exchange. The capillary transit time is not very short. So the beautiful thing is this creates a very smooth movement in terms of pressure as well as blood flow. Let's take another application of this. In this application, what they've done here is they looked at the relation between the oxygen consumption of the heart, of the cardiomyocytes, and the stroke volume. They used an anesthetized dog where they measured the cardiac output. They could pump it by the left ventricle either through the aorta or through a stiff plastic tube. Stiff means rigid, means non-compliant. Aorta means compliant vessel. And look what happens. For any given stroke volume that you put in, take this number and go up. On the native aorta, that's the oxygen consumption. If you go to the non-compliant, that's oxygen consumption. Go to this stroke volume, again you project it like that, and then for the same thing you're going to have more oxygen consumption. This means that had the aorta not been designed in such a way that makes it compliant, your heart is going to exert more effort, it's going to need more oxygen consumption, and that can have very deleterious effects. And exactly, actually, that's what happens as we age, because that leads to that's called arteriosclerosis, or hardening of the vessels. We lose some of the of this compliance. Aortic pressure here, if there is a normal compliance for a given delta V, that's how much pressure happens within the system. Take a vessel that is not as compliant. For the same delta V, for the same change, look at this, for the same change, look how much the delta P is. This means that I would need a larger pressure change will happen. And in this case, if we're measuring pulse pressure, that's definitely going to be affected. In other words, for a given stroke volume into the aorta, that's delta V, the pulse pressure between, i.e. the difference between the highest value and the lowest value, is going to be dramatically increased. If you remember 2 slides ago, the highest was 200, the lowest was 0, because there we're talking about a rigid vessel, completely non-compliant. All right, so the more compliant the vessel is, the smaller the delta P, or the pulse pressure, would be. Some of the applications, obviously, during aging. So as we age, what happens? There's going to be more hardening of the vessels. There is hypertrophy. There is proliferation of smooth muscle cells, deposition of matrix. There is increased in the vascular diameter. Eventually, that stiffness is going to reduce the compliance of the blood vessel. And in fact, if you compare an artery for a healthy adult with that of an aging person, you would realize that the change, the compliance is going to be reduced. Similarly, of course, the vein will always be highest, as we talked about. Now look at the same value where we're looking at increase in volume compared to the change in pressure. So as we age, this compliance is going to decrease. We start at the age of 2024. For any given pressure, that's what happens. Look at the values. All right, go to the age of 70, 78. You would realize that for a small change, or whatever change in pressure, the change in volume is going to be dramatically minimized. So these two curves are the same. They show the pressure volume relationship for aortas. They are obtained at autopsy from humans in different age groups. The volume pressure curves that I was just explaining. So this curve can be used to determine something called elastance. Elastance is the inverse of compliance. A vein is more compliant, but an artery is more elastic. All right? I'm going to say that again. A vein is more compliant, so we can put more volume into it with minimal pressure going, a minimal pressure change in it, right? So if we take this example here, this vein, as I increase the volume, for example, from whatever, from this number, okay, from 2500, let's say, to 3000, that's an amount of 500 milliliters. What's going to happen? Let's look at the y-axis. What's going to happen to the pressure here? That's the, sorry, that was not a very straight line. That's the delta P. Now try to do that with an artery if you could. Okay, so that's 500. Now let's see if we can increase by 500. If we do, that cannot happen. So you can see how much change that's going to happen to the pressure. A vein is more compliant. This means I can put more blood into it for a minimal change in pressure as opposed to that of the artery. The artery, however, is basically more elastic, and it would oppose this change in volume because of the smooth muscle content and the elastic fibers that we have therein. All right. So one of the applications of the system that I mentioned is that a change of, we just gave the same example, a change of several hundred milliliters in the venous volume will only change the venous pressure by only 3 to 5 millimeter Hg. That is why as much as 1/2 of a liter can be transfused into a healthy individual in only a few minutes without greatly altering the function of the circulation. Now, when we talk about arterial blood pressure, there are different factors that contribute to this. Some we already mentioned, which is compliance. Some indirectly we mentioned them, which is the systemic vascular resistance. So there are physiological factors, primarily the cardiac output, and that, what we mean by that is the stroke volume and the heart rate. You're going to have a lecture on that. And systemic vascular resistance, you're also going to visit that in a coming lecture. And there are the physical factors, which is the blood volume, as well as the nature, which we mean by that the compliance of the vessel. Interestingly, if you look at the pressure profile in the vasculature, the largest, pay attention, the largest pressure drop takes place across the arterioles here. So if you go the arteriole, look, we start here, we start here, and we end here. That's how much drop we have across this vessel. It doesn't happen the same across muscular arteries or elastic arteries or aorta or capillaries or whatever. So the largest pressure drop is across the arterioles. If you remember, we finished last lecture by saying they have the highest resistance. And pulsations in the large arteries, both systolic pressure and pulse pressure, are higher than in the aorta. This is largely due to the following notions. One, following ejection of blood from the ventricle, the pressure wave moves faster, i.e. moves at higher velocity than the blood wave. The blood wave has to do with inertia of blood. The blood wave is going to be somewhat slower than the pressure wave. Okay, that is basic physics. This basically is going to augment the pulsations by the time the blood arrives to the large arteries. You could tell me, you could argue here that, okay, blood should move from high to low, and thus it should move from large arteries back to the aorta. Well, the answer to that is the following. The driving force is basically the mean arterial pressure. Mean arterial pressure is dictated by the diastolic pressure rather than the systolic pressure. If you look at the mean arterial pressure, this one, it's always going from the high, always going to the low. So there is nothing wrong with that. Your argument would be answered by the fact that the driving force for the blood flow is the mean arterial pressure, which is more related, more closer to the diastolic, in this case, more dictated by the diastolic rather than the systolic pressure. Now, one other interesting notion here is the blip that you see in the arterial pressure curve. This is called the incisura or dicrotic notch. This is produced when the aortic valve closes. The aortic valve closure produces a brief period of retrograde flow from the aorta back towards the valve, and this briefly decreases the aortic pressure when below the systolic value. So the little pressure is lost in the aorta and large arteries due to the nature, as we mentioned, the elastic recoil, and we mentioned that's due to the elastin fibers. In the capillaries, the drop is due simply to the frictional resistance, and we start to filter the fluid outwards. In the veins and venules, the pressure drops even more. Highly compliant vessels, these are very sensible, very compliant, and the interesting thing about this is because of this natural decrease, eventually all the blood is going to pool back towards the vena cava, and thus the blood is going to go back to the heart to start a new cycle. So we mentioned in the previous slide that it is mainly dictated by the mean arterial pressure. If you look at the equation, the mean arterial pressure is diastolic pressure plus 1/3 of the pulse pressure, and the pulse pressure is basically SP minus diastolic pressure. How is the PP determined? It's primarily affected by two things: by the stroke volume, because the greater the stroke volume, the greater the amount of blood that is going to the greater the amount of blood in the arterial system, arterial tree, and thus the greater the change in the pressure increase and decrease, and thus that would lead to a greater PP. And another thing, compliance is very important. If the vessel is more compliant, you won't expect that to have a dramatic change in the pressure rise. Therefore, as we age and the vessels become less compliant, we mentioned that in one of the previous slides, as the vessels become, as the vessels become less compliant, the rise in pressure for a given stroke is going to increase. This is a rough estimation. The pulse pressure is directly proportional to the stroke volume, inversely proportional to the compliance. One of the clinical values here is that in arteriosclerosis, because compliance is decreased, ejection of stroke volume from the left ventricle is going to cause a much greater change in arterial pressure than it does in normal arteries. Remember what we mentioned a while ago, that compliance is equal to the delta V divided by delta P. And thus, if you change that equation, the delta P would be delta V divided by C. So if the compliance is going to decrease, the delta P is going to increase. And that's why in arteriosclerosis, there is a difference between the high and the low. So systolic pressure, mean arterial pressure, and pulse pressure are going to increase. In aortic stenosis, the amount ejected is smaller, so the SP and BP and MAP, mean arterial pressure, are going to decrease. Focus on arteriosclerosis and try to remember the equation. There's the couple of equations that we mentioned a while ago. One is compliance is equal to delta V volume divided by delta P pressure, and that pulse pressure is roughly stroke volume divided by compliance. So it's directly proportional to stroke volume, inversely proportional to compliance. The systemic vascular resistance, on the other hand, we're talking about these parameters, is determined by the anatomy of the network itself. Remember the series versus parallel connections, we talked about that. The vascular structure itself. This remains relatively unchanged, right, in a healthy individual. However, sometimes some pathological conditions, thrombosis, can affect the number of perfused blood vessels, and we mentioned this is important early on. The change is also in the relative number of parallel and series circuits or resistance elements is important. Take for example, in hypertension, there is some evidence that rarefaction, this is an interesting phenomenon, occurs. That is a decrease in the anatomical number of arterioles and capillaries. Go back to the slide from the previous lecture when we said what happens when you amputate a leg, when you remove a kidney, or when we said when you remove one of the parallel circuits. Go back to that and relate it to hypertension. Well, related to resistance and eventually to increase in blood pressure and thus hypertension. So here we're looking at the relationship between cardiac outputs, systemic vascular resistance, and the arterial pressure. And similar reasoning can be applied here as well to explain the changes in the arterial pressure that accompany changes in peripheral resistance. So let's look at the control conditions here. We have a cardiac output of 5 liters per minute. We're assuming the resistance is 20. Now if you calculate the Q would be the pressure divided by the resistance, 100 divided by 20, that would be 5. So the QH in this case would be equal to the QR. QH would be the cardiac output here, or what we can refer to as the cardiac output, and the QR would be the peripheral runoff, or basically the amount of blood that's going in the vessel per unit time. Let's assume that the resistance suddenly dramatically increased to 40. At this point in time, what that means, it means that the QR is going to be P divided by R, that's 100 divided by 40, that's 2.5. So the QR is going to be 2.5. Remember, the cardiac output here is 5 liters per minute. So we're pushing 5 liters per minute into the vessel. We're only letting 2.5 liters per minute leave. What would happen to the remaining 2.5? The remaining 2.5 liters per minute are going to push onto the walls, right? And remember, this is a compliant vessel, so you can see here that the vessel is bulged up. The vessel will bulge up and the pressure will continue to build up until it reaches around 200. Why 200? Because if you take 200 and you put it into the equation, QR will be equal to the pressure divided by the resistance. Resistance is 40. 200 divided by 40, that would be 5. By the time the QR is 5, that means it's equal to the cardiac output, and thus there is nothing that needs to be built into the wall, and everyone is happy. So we're pumping 5 liters per minute, and the runoff is 5 liters per minute, and everything would be fine. So the PA will remain at this new elevated, which is 200 level, as long as the QH and R do not change until something is sorted out. It is evident from what I just explained that the level of the mean arterial pressure depends on the cardiac output and the peripheral resistance, right? This dependency applies regardless whether the change in cardiac output is accomplished by a change in the heart rate or a change in the stroke volume. In fact, any change in the heart rate that is balanced by concomitant oppositely directed change in stroke volume will not change the QH, or what we call the cardiac output, and thus the arterial pressure is not going to change. Take the example of the instantaneous change in the cardiac output. We were at 10 liters, we were at 5 and we went to 10 liters per minute, all right? And the resistance is 20. So if you look at this equation, the Q in this case is going to be 100 divided by 20, and it will be 5, right? Because the resistance did not change and the pressure was 100. What's going to happen? So this is 5 and that's 10. Again, the same story. More higher cardiac output means more liters per minute are ejected into the vessel, but this has a capacity of only 5. So what's going to happen is we're going to go through the same story. We're going to, the increase that we've pushed into is going to put more force into the vessel wall, and the same story will go. The pressure is going to go up to 200 and it will remain there until we equate the two rates together. The QR is now 10 and that's equivalent to the cardiac output. So 10 liters per minute are ejected, 10 liters per minute are getting out from the vessel. We'll talk now about the venous resistance and the peripheral venous pressure. Large veins, when they are distended, they have little to no resistance. However, most of the large veins are compressed and thus they offer some resistance. Veins from arms are compressed by their sharp angulation, right, over the first strip. The atmospheric pressure on the outside causes the neck veins to collapse. That's another thing. And the abdominal pressure is compressing veins that are coursing through the abdomen, and that's important also for venous return. So basically large veins offer some resistance, and usually pressure in the more peripheral small veins in a person lying down is usually 4 to 6 millimeter Hg greater than the right atrial pressure. The venous pressure is related to many aspects when we talk about the values in the clinic. So the resistance, as I mentioned, from large artery, from large veins, that cause a pressure in the peripheral veins to be 4 to 6 millimeters higher than the right atrial pressure. If the right atrial pressure rises to 4 or 6 millimeter, so from this range, so increases by 4 to 6, there is going to be a backup of blood that enlarges the veins, and even the collapse points will open up. Collapse point, remember a while ago we mentioned there's a collapse, especially from the atmospheric pressure on the veins in the neck. So as the right atrial pressure further increases, the venous pressure is going to increase, because you've caused a backup of blood that's going to fill in the veins, and you're putting more volume into them, and that leads to more pressure in the veins. However, this is the clinical value for the right atrial pressure to reach 4 to increase by 4 plus 6. The heart must be significantly weakened. And this is very important. You will cover that in many coming lectures with the different clinicians. And the peripheral nervous pressure is not noticeably elevated in even in early stages of heart failure, as long as the person is at rest. So basically, a patient that is at rest, will be having these early stages, and we will not be able to notice the peripheral venous pressure, so although the heart has been weakened. So we'll figure that from the right atrial pressure. Now, the pressure in the abdominal cavity for a recombinant person is approximately plus 6 millimeter Hg, up to plus 30 in cases of obesity or pregnancy. There are other cases as well, or large tumors. Sometimes if the intra-abdominal pressure increases, you are putting more pressure on the veins. So the pressure in the veins of the legs themselves must rise above that in the abdominal veins, so that blood can come back from the legs going back upwards and go back into the heart. In other words, if in the abdomen we have higher pressure, you wouldn't be able to let the blood in the veins go up to go back to the heart. So what happens when the intra-abdominal pressure increases, regardless whether we have ascites, we have excessive fluid, obesity, pregnancy, large tumor, etc., regardless what the reason of this increase is, the pressure in the veins of the leg must rise above that, above whatever the value of the abdominal P, so that the valves in the veins can open up and the blood can be redirected back to the heart. This is basically similar or related to the previous slide. In an upright position, the blood pressure changes by approximately 0.77 millimeter Hgs for every centimeter of vertical distance, and that's why you look at the numbers here increasing as you go down. So this is very important. The pressure at the dorsum of the foot is 90 millimeter to 220 higher than that in the veins of the neck. Obviously depending on the person's height, because as I mentioned, it is related for every centimeter of the person's height for every centimeter of vertical distance. And keep in mind that we are assuming that the right atrial pressure is 0 in this case. A pressure of plus 6 millimeter Hg at the level of the top rib, at the level of the top rib, is due to the compression of the vein as it curves. We mentioned that a while ago, as it curves over this particular rib. There is an application of there are few applications of gravitational effect. You take the blood pressure at the same level approximately of the heart to minimize the effect of gravity. This is very important. This is an application of that. There is another application that may be relevant to you, which is veins in the skull are basically in a non-collapsible chamber. That's basically the skull cavity, and therefore a negative pressure can exist in dural sinuses of the head. So if the sagittal sinus is open during surgery, air can be sucked in, right? Because we just said that there is a negative pressure there. So air can be sucked immediately into these veins, and this may cause embolism, air embolism, and that may lead to death in certain cases. And the next we'll talk about the venous valves. The venous valves allow basically the blood to go, as you know, in unidirection. And if it were not for these valves, the pressure in the feet would be approximately 90 millimeters high in a standing adult. But we have the veins and we have the venous pumps. What happens? These are going to let the blood continuously go backwards unidirectionally to the heart. So especially when you have a moving leg, these muscles are going to basically compress. They're going to put a force on these veins. Remember, these valves have veins here and veins here. So if this is the vessel like this, the vein, we have a valve here and we have a valve here. Okay. When you squeeze here, blood is going to go in that direction and in this direction. However, this valve opens only in one direction, so it's going to close in the face of the blood that's trying to go backwards, and these valves are going to open here, so we're going to have blood going unidirectionally back to the heart. This is basically the same example that I was just explaining. So this is an elaboration and the process of milking the blood in the veins. The varicose veins, that could be some of the problems that are due to the incompetence of the venous valves. Standing or sitting for very long periods of time, that's going to cause excessive venous pressure. And if that lasts for weeks or months, like in pregnancy, or one stands most of the time, depending on his job, for example, that's going to cause stretching of the veins. However, the valves leaflets do not stretch. So what will happen is they will no longer completely be able to close, and thus the venous pressure that does not efficiently the venous pressure that's built up is going to negatively affect the venous pump, which will not efficiently work very well. That leads to fluid leakage to the tissue spaces, and legs are going to swell, and blood volume diminishes up to 20% within 30 minutes of standing still. Standing still, the key is still here. So with the excess venous pressure, there is stretching of the veins, valves do not stretch, and they will no longer close. So this is important to keep. It's been mentioned that high heels increase the residual venous volume, and that's going to increase the venous pressure, and we just mentioned what that means, and that is likely to lead to likelihood to form or to have varicose veins. We also mentioned at the beginning, if you remember, that 60 to 68% of your blood is stored, if you'd like, in the veins. So it basically acts as a reservoir. Therefore, in the cases of blood loss, there's going to be a decrease in blood pressure. There's going to be a barrage of nervous signals, carotid sinus, other pressure sensitive areas. So these are baroreceptors, if you'd like. They're going to fire up. They're going to send signals to the brain, to the central nervous system. We're going to have sympathetic activation. We're going to have, if you remember, arteriolar constriction. We said we may have also increase in the heart rate, increase in the force of contraction, but more relevantly here, we're going to have venoconstriction. We mentioned this in previous lectures, so we can go back to that. When we say venoconstriction, it's because most of the blood are here. So when you constrict, it means you are rerouting some of this blood to the heart and making it available to be so that blood pressure can go back to normal as much as possible. If you are to integrate everything again, remember you're gonna be looking at this slide later on after you finish the lectures with Dr. Bez and Dr. Bedr. So the anatomy of the vessel is going to affect vascular resistance, of course, vascular factors, tissue factors, neurohormone, neurohumoral, so nervous impulses and hormones are going to affect the vascular resistance, which we talked about, and that would be directly related to mean arterial pressure. Some of the factors are going to affect heart rate. We mentioned some of them here. Venous compliance is another important characteristic that was going to play a role in the amount that's going to go back to the heart. So that's called preload. That's going to affect stroke volume. You will cover these different aspects in different lectures, but this is basically to show that how the vascular anatomy and basic factors that are related to vessels are going to feed into the vascular resistance, which is eventually going to feed into the mean arterial pressure, which is the critical factor that we need to try to keep within certain limits. And thank you. As in the previous lecture, if you have any questions related to this, please don't hesitate to contact me. And thank you.